She should have been there at 7:30 sharp, just as she had been every Wednesday morning for the past 11 years. In Silverton, Colorado, a mountain town so small it barely registered on most maps, everyone knew each other's habits as intimately as their own. Patricia Keller was one of those constants that gave Silverton its rhythm. At the county records office, her punctuality was legend. If Patricia's desk chair sat empty at 8:00, something was wrong. When 8:30 came and the phone lines began to hum with calls from confused residents needing birth certificates and property deeds, her supervisor, Margaret Walsh, began to feel a slow, cold unease settle in her stomach. She dialed Patricia's number once, twice, then a third time. 14 rings each time, no answer. The silence on the other end wasn't just absence, it was presence, a heavy, unnatural stillness, like the hush before an avalanche when the mountain seems to pause, waiting to release its fury. Patricia Keller had been 43 that winter of 1992, a woman whose life ran with the precision of clockwork. Since her husband Robert's death in a mining accident 7 years earlier, she had built her world out of careful, almost ceremonial order. Her small 2-story house on Mineral Street stood as a testament to that discipline, painted a soft yellow with white trim, a chain-link fence enclosing a neat yard she'd maintained herself. Every morning unfolded in the same rhythm: coffee at 6:15, shower at 6:30, out the door by 7:10 for the 12-minute walk to the courthouse. She wore practicality like armor, short brown hair, clean shoes, and one of 3 well-worn cardigans she rotated with mathematical precision. Her life was one of quiet endurance, built on small rituals that kept her grief from spilling over. When Margaret decided to check on her during her lunch break, the January air bit at her face, the temperature having plunged to 8 degrees. The sky pressed down heavy and grey, swallowing sound. Patricia's house looked almost picturesque in the winter stillness, icicles dangling from the roof like frozen glass, the path to the front steps swept clean, the kind of scene that might have graced a Christmas postcard. But something about its stillness felt off, too perfect, as though time had stopped. Margaret knocked hard enough for her knuckles to sting, then tried the door. It opened easily. Inside, the house was immaculate. Patricia's coffee mug sat washed and drying on the rack, a small puddle beneath it catching the afternoon light. The bed upstairs was made with crisp hospital corners. The air smelled faintly of lavender soap, the kind Patricia ordered from a Denver catalog every spring. Everything spoke of routine, of care, of a life that had been tended to like a well-kept garden. Everything except for 2 things. Her winter coat still hung neatly on the hook by the door, and her boots, dusted with yesterday's salt and snow, sat untouched on the mat below. Standing in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary echoes of a life paused mid-motion, Margaret felt something in her chest tighten, not with panic yet, but with an ancient, wordless recognition. It was the kind of instinct that comes before logic, a primal understanding older than thought. Something terrible had happened. The world had shifted, silently, invisibly, and nothing in Silverton would ever feel entirely safe again. The Silverton Police Department was hardly equipped for something like this. It consisted of Chief Douglas Thompson and 2 part-time officers, whose days usually revolved around parking tickets, traffic stops, and the occasional bar fight at the Silver Nugget Saloon. So when Margaret Walsh's trembling voice came through the station line at 12:45 that afternoon, reporting Patricia Keller missing, Douglas had no procedure to fall back on, only instinct. Within 10 minutes, his cruiser was parked in front of the yellow house on Mineral Street, exhaust curling into the brittle mountain air. He stepped into Patricia's kitchen, where the warmth from the wood stove had long faded, and his breath clouded in the stillness. At 56, Thompson was a man worn down by years of small-town quiet, a transplant from Wyoming who had taken the Silverton job thinking it would be a soft landing into retirement. The job had promised him snow-dusted mornings, tourist summers, and nothing more dangerous than a drunk miner or a lost hiker. But as he walked through Patricia's house with Margaret trailing close behind, notebook in hand, he could feel the calm certainty of that assumption unraveling. Everything inside was unnervingly normal. Patricia's purse sat on her dresser, her wallet inside with $63 untouched. Her car keys hung neatly on a hook by the back door. The bathroom was spotless, towels were folded with a precision that spoke of habit, not haste. Her work clothes, pressed slacks, a cream blouse, and the grey cardigan she often wore on Wednesdays, hung in perfect alignment in the bedroom closet. There was no chaos, no overturned chair, no broken glass. Only the absence of Patricia, vibrating through the house like a sound too low to hear, but impossible to ignore. It was Douglas who found the anomaly, the back door. Not the front, where neighbors might have seen something, but the side facing the narrow alley that ran behind the houses, where the garbage trucks rattled through on Thursday mornings. The door wasn't damaged, wasn't forced, it was simply unlocked. He crouched down, joints popping in protest, and examined the frame. No splintered wood, no footprints on the stoop except one, Patricia's, he assumed. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. The backyard lay silent under a thick quilt of snow, smooth and glittering beneath the pale afternoon light. Only one set of footprints broke the surface, small deliberate steps leading 15 feet from the back door toward the fence line. Then suddenly they ended, not turned back, not disturbed, just stopped. As if Patricia Keller had walked a short distance into her own backyard and then evaporated into the frozen air. By 4 o'clock, the news had spread through Silverton like wildfire in dry timber, carried in low murmurs across the post office, the grocery store, and the diner. Patricia Keller, the dependable woman who'd processed marriage licenses and property deeds for half the town, who had survived the Lucky Strike mine collapse that had killed her husband in '85, who had held herself together with quiet dignity when others would have crumbled, was gone. No struggle, no trace, just gone. Chief Thompson didn't waste time. He knew the temperature would drop fast, and in these mountains, a few hours could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. By dusk, 37 volunteers gathered in the courthouse parking lot, men in hunting jackets and steel-toed boots, women clutching flashlights and thermoses of coffee. Their faces were grim, their breath rising like smoke into the frozen air. They all knew what searches like this usually found. Thompson divided them into groups of 4 and mapped out a 2-mile search radius around Patricia's house. They would sweep the grid until dark, then start again at first light. Margaret Walsh joined one of the first teams, despite the chief's gentle insistence that she go home. She couldn't. Sitting still felt like surrender, like betraying Patricia by giving up before she was truly lost. The searchers fanned out across Silverton's narrow streets, calling Patricia's name into the growing dark. Their flashlights swung across fences, down alleyways, into the thick timber of the surrounding forest, where ponderosa pines loomed like solemn witnesses. They checked old mine shafts sealed decades earlier, peered into creek beds where the water ran black beneath sheets of ice, and followed faint depressions in the snow that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. One group found a scarf frozen near the elementary school. Margaret identified it immediately as belonging to a teacher. Another team found animal tracks near the abandoned railroad depot that led only to a fox's den. Each lead evaporated under the cold, leaving only the echo of unanswered questions. By the time darkness swallowed the valley and the temperature plunged below zero, Chief Thompson called off the search. The volunteers trudged back toward town, their flashlights dimming, their faces drawn tight with fatigue and dread. In the stillness of that mountain night, the only thing more haunting than Patricia Keller's disappearance was the silence she left behind, a silence so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on every heart in Silverton. That night, Douglas Thompson sat in Patricia's kitchen with Officer Frank Hamilton, both men nursing cold coffee and trying to make sense of the evidence that wasn't evidence. Hamilton was 28, still young enough to believe that police work meant clear answers and satisfying resolutions. He kept circling back to the footprints in the snow, the ones that simply ended. Thompson had seen those prints, had photographed them from every angle before the wind erased them entirely. They were Patricia's size, made by bare feet or thin-soled slippers, pressed into 4 inches of powder that had fallen 2 days earlier. They walked in a straight line toward the back fence, spaced normally, showing no signs of running or struggling, and then they stopped in the middle of the yard, with nothing around them but unmarked snow stretching 30 feet in every direction. Hamilton suggested theories that Thompson shot down one by one, with the weary patience of a man who'd worked his share of impossible cases. Someone could have carried her from that point, Hamilton offered, but Thompson pointed out that any person carrying a 130-pound woman through deep snow would have left tracks twice as deep or drag marks or some sign of the transfer. Could she have been lifted into a vehicle? But there was no alley access, no tire tracks, and the fence stood 6 feet high with no gate. Could she have jumped the fence? Thompson had checked for scuff marks on the chain link, for compressed snow on the other side, nothing. It was as if Patricia Keller had walked 15 feet into her backyard and been plucked from the earth by invisible hands. By the 3rd day, the investigation had expanded beyond Silverton's capability. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation sent 2 agents who took over the case with the efficient detachment of professionals who'd seen too much to be shocked by disappearances anymore. They interviewed Margaret Walsh for 3 hours, asking about Patricia's routine, her relationships, her state of mind. They questioned the neighbors on Mineral Street, all 6 households within shouting distance of the yellow house. An elderly couple named the Andersons reported hearing nothing unusual that night. A young family with 3 children had been at the wife's parents' house in Durango. The others offered the same story. A quiet night, no screams, no sounds of struggle, nothing to suggest that a woman was being erased from existence just yards away from their sleeping children. The agents processed Patricia's house like an archaeological site, dusting for fingerprints that revealed only Patricia's own and Margaret's from that first afternoon. They photographed every room, bagged potential evidence that would sit in storage for decades. They found nothing that suggested foul play, and nothing that suggested Patricia had planned to leave. Her toothbrush was still wet in the bathroom, a library book lay open on her nightstand, bookmarked at page 73 of a romance novel she would never finish. In the kitchen trash, they found a grocery receipt dated the day before her disappearance, listing ingredients for meals she'd never cook. The house told the story of a life interrupted mid-breath, as if Patricia had simply paused between one moment and the next and forgotten to resume existing. The contradictions began to surface like bodies rising from deep water, each one pulling the investigation in a different direction, until Chief Thompson felt like a man trying to hold together a rope that was unraveling from both ends. On the fourth day after Patricia's disappearance, the CBI agents discovered something they'd missed during the initial sweep of the house. In the basement, tucked behind the old furnace where shadows pooled thick as motor oil, they found a window. It was small, the kind builders installed for ventilation rather than entry, measuring barely 2 feet across. The window was unlatched from the inside, not broken, not forced, simply unlocked as if someone had opened it deliberately and forgotten to secure it. Again, Agent Michael Stewart crouched in front of that window for 20 minutes, his flashlight beam cutting through dust motes that danced in the cold air. The window opened onto a narrow well that dropped 5 feet below ground level, accessible only by crawling on your belly through a space so tight it would make a claustrophobic person weep. Stewart was 41 years old, a veteran of 18 years with the CBI, and he'd learned long ago that the most important evidence often hid in the places people avoided looking. He examined the window frame with a magnifying glass, searching for tool marks or signs of tampering. The wood was old, painted over so many times the layers looked like geological strata, but there were no scratches, no fresh damage, nothing to indicate forced entry from outside. The discovery of the unlocked basement window should have provided answers, but instead it spawned a dozen new questions that metastasized through the investigation like cancer cells. If someone had entered through that window, they would have had to know it existed, would have had to navigate the well in complete darkness, would have had to be small enough to squeeze through an opening that Stewart himself couldn't fit through without removing his jacket. And if they'd come in through the basement, how had they convinced Patricia to walk barefoot into her backyard in the middle of a January night when the temperature hovered near zero? There were no signs of struggle in the house, no overturned furniture or broken glass, nothing to suggest she'd been dragged or forced. The evidence pointed in two directions simultaneously, toward an intruder who'd entered impossibly and toward a woman who'd walked willingly to her own vanishing. Agent Rebecca Hamilton, Stewart's partner, focused her attention on the footprints in the backyard before they disappeared entirely under fresh snowfall. She'd made castings of them on that first day, working quickly as the afternoon sun threatened to melt the evidence into meaningless depressions. Now, in the warmth of the Silverton police station, she studied those plaster casts with the intensity of a fortune teller reading tea leaves. The prints were definitive, size 7 made by bare feet, toes slightly splayed as if the person had been cold. Patricia wore size 7 shoes, but what made Hamilton's stomach turn was the depth and spacing of the prints. They were evenly spaced, showing no signs of stumbling or hesitation. The depth was consistent, suggesting a person walking at a normal pace, not running or being forced forward. The final print, the one where the trail simply ended, was no deeper than the others, no indication of a person stopping abruptly, no scuff marks suggesting a struggle, just a final footprint in the snow and then nothing. The local volunteers had their own theories, whispered in the coffee shop and the hardware store, theories that the CBI agents listened to with the patience of anthropologists studying a foreign culture. Some believed Patricia had suffered a mental break, had wandered off in a fugue state and succumbed to hypothermia somewhere in the mountains where her body would never be found. Others, the ones who'd known Robert Keller and remembered how his death had hollowed Patricia out like a gutted building, suggested suicide. But Margaret Walsh shut down that theory with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She'd worked beside Patricia for 11 years, had watched her rebuild her life with methodical determination after Robert's death. Patricia wasn't the kind of woman who would walk into the snow and give up. She was the kind who showed up for work every morning at 7:30 sharp, who processed paperwork with meticulous attention, who planned her grocery shopping 3 weeks in advance. By the end of the first week, the CBI agents had interviewed 47 people and accumulated a file 2 inches thick that contained more contradictions than conclusions. They'd found fibers on the basement window frame that didn't match anything in Patricia's house, synthetic material that the state lab identified as coming from work gloves, the kind sold in every hardware store between Denver and the Mexican border. They'd found a partial fingerprint on the back door handle, smudged and incomplete, impossible to match to any database. They'd analyzed the soil in the window well and found traces of motor oil and cigarette ash, though Patricia didn't smoke and had no car. Every piece of evidence pointed toward an intruder, but an intruder who'd left no clear trail, no definitive proof, nothing that would stand up in a courtroom if they ever found someone to charge. On the 9th day, a snowplow operator named Carl Wilson called the police station, with information that made Stewart and Hamilton drive to his house within the hour. Carl lived 3 blocks from Patricia's yellow house, and on the night she disappeared, he'd been awake at 3 in the morning with insomnia, standing at his kitchen window drinking warm milk. He'd seen a figure walking down Mineral Street, moving slowly, hunched against the cold. He couldn't say for certain it was Patricia, couldn't even say for certain it was a woman, just a figure in dark clothing heading toward the edge of town where the streetlights ended and the forest began. He'd thought nothing of it at the time, had gone back to bed an hour later, and forgotten about it until he heard the news. Stewart asked why he'd waited 9 days to come forward, and Carl Wilson shrugged and said he hadn't thought it mattered, hadn't wanted to waste police time with something he wasn't sure about. Stewart thanked him and left, feeling like he was trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces belonged to a different picture entirely. The suspicion crept into Silverton like carbon monoxide, invisible and toxic, poisoning relationships that had endured for decades. It started with sideways glances and conversations that stopped abruptly when certain people entered the grocery store. Within 2 weeks of Patricia's disappearance, the town had fractured into camps of accusation and defense, neighbor turning against neighbor with the kind of viciousness that only intimacy can breed. Chief Thompson watched it happen with the helpless frustration of a man trying to stop a forest fire with a garden hose. He'd lived in small towns long enough to know that when tragedy struck and answers failed to materialize, communities needed someone to blame, someone to carry the weight of their fear and confusion. The first name to fall under the shadow of suspicion was Kenneth Fraser, Patricia Keller's former brother-in-law, and the kind of man whose life seemed to attract misfortune like rust to iron. Kenneth had once been married to Robert Keller's sister, but their marriage had dissolved 3 years earlier in a bitter, drawn-out separation that fractured what little remained of the extended Keller family. After the divorce, Kenneth drifted to the outskirts of Silverton, where he lived in a dented aluminum trailer that leaned slightly to one side, surrounded by discarded tools and the skeletal remains of old appliances. He was 52 years old, unemployed more often than not, and drank just heavily enough that his name always surfaced when something ugly happened in town. The rumors began innocently enough, a sighting here, a whisper there. A neighbor claimed to have seen Kenneth walking past Patricia's yellow house 3 times in the week before she vanished. Another swore he'd stopped near her fence and lingered longer than seemed necessary. In a town as small as Silverton, that was all it took for suspicion to bloom like frost overnight. When Agent Stewart and Agent Hamilton arrived from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, they found Kenneth sitting in his cluttered trailer, his shaking hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. His eyes were bloodshot, his cheeks gray with fatigue and liquor withdrawal. "I didn't do nothing to Patricia," he said, voice trembling between anger and desperation. "She was the only one who still talked to me after the divorce. I was just checking on her, that's all." With his hesitant permission, the agent searched the trailer, a task made harder by the chaos inside. Empty whiskey bottles filled the kitchen sink. Towers of magazines leaned precariously against the walls. Unpaid bills spilled from the counter. A bare mattress lay on the floor beside an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. The smell of stale alcohol and unwashed clothes hung thick in the air. But for all its squalor, there was nothing there that hinted at violence. No blood, no torn clothing, no jewelry that might have belonged to Patricia. Nothing but the quiet misery of a man whose life had collapsed in on itself years before. Still, Silverton wasn't interested in nuance. People remembered that Kenneth had always been odd, that his eyes had lingered a little too long on Patricia during family gatherings, that his jokes had sometimes crossed the line between awkward and unsettling. And because Kenneth couldn't remember what he'd been doing the night of January 8th, only that he'd been drinking and had blacked out, the absence of evidence didn't save him from public judgment. In a town desperate for a villain, his failure to be respectable was enough. The next target of suspicion wore a collar instead of a work shirt. Father James Murphy, 58 years old, served as the parish priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Patricia Keller had been a devout member since her husband's death. Murphy had come to Silverton 7 years earlier from a quiet parish in Nebraska, a soft-spoken man with thinning gray hair and a fondness for fly fishing and batch records. To most, he was gentle and kind, a source of comfort for the grieving and guidance for the lost. To others, after Patricia's disappearance, he suddenly looked like a man with secrets. It started with a memory, someone recalling that Father Murphy had visited Patricia's home twice in the months before she went missing. The visits had been long, each lasting well over an hour. Under normal circumstances, nobody would have thought twice about it. But in the anxious fog that hung over Silverton after Patricia vanished, every kindness became suspicious, every act of compassion reinterpreted as potential deceit. When questioned by Agents Stewart and Hamilton, Murphy sat stiffly in the rectory's small sitting room, his hands folded around a rosary. His discomfort was palpable, though whether from guilt or indignation was impossible to tell. Patricia was struggling, he explained softly. She asked for guidance. She was tormented by thoughts about her husband, whether his soul had found peace, whether she'd done enough to honor him. I went to her home to counsel her, nothing more. The agents searched his modest quarters beside the church. They found rows of theological texts, a worn Bible filled with margin notes, a fly-fishing rod propped by the back door, and a record player with stacks of classical albums, Beethoven, Bach, Mozart. It was the home of a quiet, solitary man, not a killer. Yet even in its innocence, there was something disquieting about its orderliness, the way nothing seemed out of place. Father Murphy's biggest problem was his alibi, or rather, his lack of one. On the night of January 8th, he claimed he'd been alone in the rectory, reading scripture and writing sermon notes before going to bed early. No one could confirm it. No one had seen him that evening. When the agents spoke with parishioners, they encountered two very different narratives. Mrs. Dorothy Anderson, the elderly organist with hands knotted like tree roots, described Murphy as a saintly man who wouldn't hurt a fly. But Lisa Thompson, a younger member of the congregation, told a different story, that she'd once seen the priest place a hand on Patricia's shoulder during confession, and that the gesture had looked too tender, too personal. No charges were ever filed. The agents could find no physical evidence linking Father Murphy to Patricia's disappearance. But in Silverton, truth mattered less than the vacuum left behind. And in that vacuum, whispers grew louder than facts. The priest's once adoring parish now watched him from a distance during Sunday Mass, their eyes filled with unease. His sermons shortened, attendance dropped. And when Father Murphy walked through town, heads turned, conversations hushed, and children were called quietly back to their mothers' sides. In Silverton, innocence wasn't something you proved. It was something you had to earn back, and neither Kenneth Fraser nor Father James Murphy ever would. The third and most painful target was David Wilson, Patricia's neighbor who lived directly across the street from her yellow house. David was 34 years old, worked as an accountant for a mining company, and had been divorced for 2 years. He lived alone with his border collie in a house he'd inherited from his grandparents and had known Patricia for most of his life. The suspicion fell on him because he'd been the one to retrieve Patricia's mail for her when she went on vacation, because he'd helped her install the chain-link fence the previous summer, because he'd been seen talking to her on her front porch the evening before she disappeared. When Stewart and Hamilton questioned him, David broke down crying, his hands covering his face as he insisted he'd loved Patricia like a sister, had only been checking on her because she'd seemed tired lately, had seemed distracted in a way that worried him. The agents searched David's house and found nothing incriminating, but they did find something that made them exchange meaningful glances in his bedroom closet, hidden behind winter coats. They discovered a shoebox containing photographs. The photographs showed Patricia at various community events, the 4th of July parade, the church picnic, the winter festival downtown. She wasn't the primary subject of any photo, but she appeared in the background or edges of shots that supposedly documented other things. David explained frantically that he was an amateur photographer, that he took pictures at all local events, that Patricia happened to be in some frames because Silverton was a small town where everyone appeared in everyone else's photos. The explanation was plausible but unconvincing, and though the agents couldn't charge him with anything, they left his house with the sick certainty that David Wilson had been harboring feelings for Patricia that she'd probably never reciprocated. The corrosive effect of suspicion transformed Silverton from a community into a collection of isolated households where people locked doors that had never been locked before and regarded longtime neighbors with barely concealed hostility. Margaret Walsh found herself defending Kenneth Fraser to the book club members who decided he must be guilty. Defending Father Murphy to the ladies at the hair salon who whispered about inappropriate relationships. Defending David Wilson to co-workers who claimed they'd always known something was wrong with him. The defense exhausted her, left her feeling like she was trying to hold back an avalanche with her bare hands. Chief Thompson conducted follow-up interviews with all three men, checking and rechecking their alibis, searching for inconsistencies that might justify an arrest, but the truth was simpler and more frustrating. Any one of them could have been involved, or none of them could have been, and without concrete evidence, the case was stalling like an engine running out of fuel. By March of 1992, the investigation into Patricia Keller's disappearance had become a file cabinet in the corner of Chief Thompson's office, a stack of folders that grew thinner each week as leads evaporated like morning dew on hot asphalt. The CBI agents had returned to Denver after 6 weeks of intensive work, leaving behind a case summary that ran to 83 pages and concluded with the bureaucratic euphemism that the investigation remained open, pending new evidence. Thompson read that phrase and understood its real meaning. They'd done everything they could do with the technology and resources available in 1992, and now Patricia Keller would join the ranks of the disappeared, the ones who haunted filing systems and family memories, but never received the closure of a body or an arrest. The physical searches had ceased after the first month when it became clear that Patricia wasn't lying injured somewhere in the surrounding forest, that if she died of exposure, her body had been claimed by terrain too vast and unforgiving to yield its secrets easily. The San Juan Mountains stretch for hundreds of miles in every direction, cut through with abandoned mine shafts and ravines where a person could vanish as completely as smoke in wind. Search and rescue teams had covered a 10-mile radius around Silverton, using tracking dogs that lost the scent at Patricia's back fence and never picked it up again. Helicopters had flown grid patterns over the wilderness, thermal imaging cameras, searching for heat signatures that never materialized. Volunteer searchers had tramped through snow and mud until exhaustion forced them home, finding nothing but the ordinary detritus of mountain life: beer cans from hunters, old campfire rings, the bleached bones of deer and elk that had nothing to do with Patricia's fate. Margaret Walsh refused to accept the investigation's slow death. She took vacation days to drive to Denver and sit in the CBI office, politely demanding updates from agents who had other cases, demanding their attention, fresher tragedies that still had the possibility of resolution. She called the Silverton police station every Monday morning to ask if there had been any developments, knowing before Thompson answered that there hadn't been, needing to hear his tired voice confirm it anyway. She organized fundraisers to keep Patricia's case in the public consciousness, selling baked goods at the community center to raise money for a reward fund that eventually grew to $12,000, a sum that seemed enormous in a town where most families lived paycheck to paycheck, but proved insufficient to generate the kind of tip that breaks cases open. In May, Margaret convinced the town council to approve the installation of a memorial bench in the small park near the courthouse, a simple wooden structure with a brass plaque that read, "In memory of Patricia Keller, 1949–1992, forever in our hearts." The question mark of that end date haunted everyone who read it, the way the plaque assumed death without confirmation, the way it tried to impose narrative closure on a story that had no ending. The bench dedication drew 73 people on a Saturday afternoon when the aspen trees were just beginning to leaf out, and the air smelled of pine sap and possibility. Margaret gave a speech that she rehearsed for 3 days but still broke down during, her voice cracking when she talked about Patricia's kindness, her reliability, the hole she'd left in the fabric of daily life that could never be mended with platitudes or memorials. By the first anniversary of Patricia's disappearance in January of 1993, the case had achieved a kind of terrible equilibrium. The rumors about Kenneth Fraser and Father Murphy and David Wilson had faded into background noise. None of the men were charged, none of them exonerated, all of them living under the permanent cloud of suspicion that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In Silverton, Kenneth had stopped drinking for 4 months after the initial interrogations, then started again with a vengeance that would eventually kill him in 1996 when his liver finally surrendered. Father Murphy requested a transfer to a different parish, citing the need for new spiritual challenges but fooling nobody, and left Silverton in the fall of 1993 to spend the rest of his career in a small town in Montana where no one knew his history. David Wilson sold his house and moved to Colorado Springs, where he worked as an accountant for an insurance company and never spoke about why he'd left his hometown. Chief Thompson organized a small vigil on January 8, 1993, inviting anyone who wanted to remember Patricia to gather at the memorial bench. 32 people came, a fraction of the crowd that had attended the dedication, and they stood in the cold holding candles that the wind kept extinguishing. Margaret read a poem she'd written, something about stars and memory and unanswered prayers, and several people cried quietly. Thompson noticed that attendance represented mostly older residents, the ones who'd known Patricia personally. The younger families who'd moved to town in the past year had no connection to her disappearance, regarded it as tragic but abstract, someone else's sorrow that didn't require their participation. He understood then that Patricia was already beginning to fade into local mythology, becoming the cautionary tale parents told children about locking doors and being careful, losing her specificity and humanity in the process of becoming a symbol. The case was officially transferred to cold case status in March of 1994, filed alongside 3 other unsolved disappearances in Colorado that year and 114 others across the western United States. A new filing system had been implemented, and Patricia's case received a reference number, CC 920847. Thompson kept a copy of the main file in his office, separate from the archived material sent to state storage, and would sometimes take it out late at night when insomnia kept him at his desk, reading through witness statements and forensic reports, as if repetition might reveal some detail he'd missed. It never did. The file told the same story every time. A woman had walked into her backyard on a January night and ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions and a community that would never quite recover from the wound of not knowing. The years moved over Silverton like weather, eroding the sharp edges of Patricia Keller's disappearance until it became part of the town's foundation, a story everyone knew but few actively remembered. By 2005, 13 years after Patricia had vanished, the yellow house on Mineral Street had changed hands 3 times. The chain-link fence she'd installed remained, now rusted and sagging in places, and the new owners had painted the exterior a pale blue that seemed chosen specifically to erase Patricia's presence from the visual record. The basement window that had caused so much speculation had been sealed with concrete blocks during a renovation in 1998, eliminating the source of nightmares for a family with young children who'd moved in not knowing the house's history. Margaret Walsh was 59 years old in 2005, still working at the county records office, though she'd cut her hours to part-time. Her joints ached with arthritis, and her memory wasn't quite as sharp as it had been when Patricia had occupied the desk beside hers. She no longer organized vigils or fundraisers, had stopped calling the police for updates years ago when it became clear that no updates would ever come. But she thought about Patricia every single day, in the small ways that grief becomes habitual. When she unlocked the office at 7:30, when she saw women with short, practical haircuts. When January 8th appeared on the calendar, and she took the day off without explanation. The $12,000 reward fund had been quietly absorbed back into the town's general budget after 10 years of generating no viable leads, and Margaret hadn't protested because protest felt like shouting into a void that had already swallowed everything that mattered. Chief Douglas Thompson had retired in 2002 at the age of 66, moving to Arizona with his wife to escape the mountain winters that had begun to aggravate his heart condition. His replacement was a younger woman named Sarah Mitchell, who'd transferred from Grand Junction, and she'd inherited Patricia's cold case file, along with 24 others that predated her tenure. Mitchell was professional and competent, but she had no personal connection to the case, no memory of Patricia as a living woman with habits and preferences. To Mitchell, Patricia Keller was a name on a form, a tragedy that belonged to the previous generation's watch. While she would have investigated diligently if new evidence emerged, she didn't spend sleepless nights wondering what had happened in that backyard 13 years ago. The town itself had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The population had grown to nearly 2,000 as Silverton became a destination for tourists seeking authentic mountain experiences and retirees looking for small-town tranquility. New businesses had opened along Main Street, a coffee shop that served lattes and had Wi-Fi, a gallery selling local art at prices that made longtime residents laugh bitterly, a boutique hotel and a renovated mining office that charged $300 a night. The old-timers still gathered at the Silver Nugget Saloon, but increasingly they found themselves outnumbered by newcomers who had no shared history, no collective memory of the events that had shaped the town's character. When Patricia's name came up in conversation, which happened less and less frequently, the younger residents would ask who she was, and the explanations grew shorter and less detailed with each retelling, until the story compressed into a single sentence. A woman disappeared in '92, and they never found her. The memorial bench in the park had weathered to a soft grey, the brass plaque tarnished and barely legible unless you knelt down and looked closely. Homeless transients sometimes slept on it during summer nights, and teenagers used it as a meeting spot, sitting on Patricia's memorial to drink beer and share cigarettes, completely unaware of the significance of the location. Margaret had stopped polishing the plaque years ago when she realized that preservation was a losing battle against time and indifference. In 2008, the town council briefly discussed removing the bench during a park renovation project, noting that it was falling apart and that most current residents had no idea who Patricia Keller had been. Margaret attended that council meeting, the only person who spoke during public comment, and her quiet request to leave the bench undisturbed had been honored, not out of respect for Patricia, but out of discomfort with the old woman's obvious pain. Kenneth Fraser had died in 1996, as predicted, his liver finally failing after years of abuse, and was buried in the Silverton cemetery without ceremony. Father Murphy had died of a heart attack in Montana in 2003, and the obituary that appeared in the Silverton newspaper made no mention of his years at St. Mary's or the cloud of suspicion that had driven him away. David Wilson still lived in Colorado Springs, now 49 years old, remarried with 2 children, working at the same insurance company where he'd been employed for 15 years. He never returned to Silverton, even for his own father's funeral in 2007, and the few people who'd known him growing up had long since stopped speculating about whether his departure constituted guilt or simply self-preservation. In 2010, a journalist from Denver wrote a long-form article about unsolved disappearances in rural Colorado, dedicating 3 paragraphs to Patricia Keller's case. The article included the basic facts, the mysterious footprints, the unlocked basement window, the 3 men who'd been suspected but never charged. It described Silverton as a town that had moved on, which was both true and completely false. The journalist had spent 2 days in town, interviewing Margaret Walsh and Chief Mitchell, and a handful of residents who barely remembered the case, and had concluded that Patricia's disappearance had become just another piece of mountain folklore, no more real than stories about lost gold mines or ghost towns. What the journalist had missed was the way certain people still locked their doors compulsively, still felt a chill when they walked past the Blue House on Mineral Street, still carried an awareness that terrible things could happen in places that seemed safe, and that sometimes those terrible things were never explained, or resolved, or avenged. The call came to Chief Sarah Mitchell's office on an otherwise uneventful Tuesday morning in April of 2018, 26 years after Patricia Keller had walked barefoot into her backyard and vanished into the strange mythology that small towns build around their ghosts. The Silverton Police Department was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that feels too clean, too practiced, until a sound cuts through it and changes everything. The sound was the ring of Mitchell's office phone. At 53, Sarah Mitchell had long since grown accustomed to the ebb and flow of tragedy. She had been chief for 16 years, and she could recognize the tone of a state investigator who'd just stumbled upon something heavy, the kind of discovery that rearranged old certainties. On the other end of the line was Detective Ryan Campbell from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. His voice was careful, deliberate, the words coming out in a cadence that told her this call wasn't routine. "Chief Mitchell," he began, "do you remember the Keller case, from 1992? Mitchell leaned back in her chair, the phone pressed to her ear, her eyes drifting toward the row of cold case files that lined the metal cabinet by her desk. She rose, crossed the room, and pulled open the drawer that hadn't been touched in years. The Keller file was right where she expected it to be, an agging manila folder softened by time, its edges curled and its label fading to a faint, dusty yellow. When she opened it, the faint smell of mildew rose up, mingling with the paper's musty weight of memory. "Yes," she told Campbell, "I remember it as well as anyone could remember a case they didn't personally work." Campbell explained that the CBI had begun a statewide review of cold cases from the 1980s and 1990s, cases frozen in time before the modern reach of DNA analysis. They were pulling old evidence from dusty storage rooms, re-examining items that had been collected but never fully explored because the science of the day simply wasn't capable of what the present now allowed. Patricia Keller's file, it turned out, had made the list. The original investigators had been thorough, if limited by their tools. They had bagged fibers found along the basement window frame, traces of cigarette ash near the window well, and a small piece of fabric snagged on a nail along Patricia's backyard fence. Back then, that fragment of dark cloth, no more than 3 inches by 2, had seemed insignificant. It was logged, noted, and dismissed as likely belonging to a passing worker or perhaps a stray animal brushing by. Too ordinary, too generic. It had then been sealed in a paper bag and filed away in a Denver evidence locker, where it lay undisturbed for 26 years, buried among thousands of forgotten relics from hundreds of unsolved tragedies. But when the forensic team pulled that fragment from storage in February of 2018, something remarkable happened. Despite decades of neglect, microscopic traces of biological material still clung to the weave of the cloth, skin cells invisible to the naked eye, yet perfectly preserved in the fibers, like fossils waiting for the right century to be seen. Using techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 1992, the lab extracted the DNA, amplified it, and produced a complete genetic profile. Then came the moment every cold case investigator hopes for but rarely experiences. They ran the sample through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a vast national database containing over 17 million genetic profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes. And this time, the system answered back. Mitchell's fingers tightened around the receiver. Campbell's tone shifted, still professional but trembling slightly at the edges, as if excitement and disbelief were wrestling inside him. The DNA profile from Patricia Keller's backyard hadn't produced a perfect match, but something almost as significant. It pointed to a biological relative of someone already in the system, a sibling, a child, or perhaps a parent. Somewhere out there was a living connection to whoever had left that trace of themselves behind all those years ago. Campbell refused to say more over the phone. He wanted to come to Silverton in person. That in itself told Mitchell everything she needed to know. This wasn't just another lead to be logged and forgotten. Something in that old scrap of fabric had cracked the silence of 26 years. When she hung up the phone, Sarah Mitchell stared for a long moment at the Keller file spread open before her. The photographs were faded now, the grainy shots of Patricia's yellow house, the backyard fence, the trampled snow. It felt like looking at ghosts printed on paper. For the next 3 hours, she tried to temper her expectations, though her pulse wouldn't settle. 26 years was a lifetime in criminal investigation. Witnesses died, memories eroded, alibis hardened into folklore. The town had long since moved on, layering new stories over old wounds. And yet, as sunlight spilled across her desk that morning, Sarah Mitchell felt something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of possibility, like a breath returning to a body everyone had long assumed was gone. When Campbell arrived at 4 that afternoon, he brought a younger analyst named Jessica Torres, who carried a laptop and a folder thick with documentation. They sat in Mitchell's office with the door closed, the afternoon sun slanting through Venetian blinds and creating bars of light across the desk. Campbell opened the folder and showed Mitchell the DNA analysis pages of graphs and charts that meant nothing to her untrained eye, but that Campbell translated into plain language. The skin cells on the fabric belonged to a male Caucasian, based on genetic markers, likely between 30 and 50 years old at the time the cells were deposited. The familiar match in CODIS belonged to a man named Brandon Thomas, who'd been arrested in 2014 for domestic assault in Grand Junction and had his DNA collected as part of standard booking procedures. Brandon Thomas was 47 years old in 2018, worked as a supervisor at a construction company, and had lived in Grand Junction for the past 12 years. He had no connection to Silverton that anyone could immediately identify, had never been questioned in relation to Patricia Keller's disappearance, and had been only 20 years old in 1992, living in Wyoming according to his driver's license records. But Brandon's DNA indicated that someone closely related to him, likely a father or brother or uncle, had left biological material on Patricia's fence around the time of her disappearance. Gamble explained that familiar DNA searches were controversial, had been challenged in courts across the country on privacy grounds, but Colorado allowed their use in cold cases involving serious crimes. The technique had been used to solve the Golden State Killer case in California and had reopened investigations that everyone assumed were permanently closed. Mitchell asked the obvious question: who was Brandon Thomas related to? Campbell and Torres exchanged a glance that made Mitchell's stomach drop before Campbell answered. Brandon Thomas had an older brother named Gregory Thomas, 53 years old, who in 1992 had been 27 and working as a contractor in the Silverton area. Gregory Thomas had left Colorado in 1993, moved to Nevada for 5 years, then to Oregon, where he'd lived quietly since 1998, working construction and landscaping jobs, never arrested, never generating the kind of attention that would have put his DNA in any database. But Brandon's DNA suggested strongly that Gregory's DNA would match the profile extracted from the fence fabric. Torres pulled up a photograph on her laptop, a driver's license photo from the Oregon DMV showing a weathered face with grey stubble and tired eyes, a face that meant nothing to Mitchell, but that would soon become the most important image in Silverton's recent history. The name Gregory Thomas meant nothing to Sarah Mitchell, and a search through the original case files revealed that it had meant nothing to the investigators in 1992 either. He'd never been interviewed, never appeared in witness statements, existed in that investigation as a complete absence. But Detective Campbell had done preliminary work before driving to Silverton, had pulled records that painted a picture of a man who'd been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to be involved in Patricia Keller's disappearance. In January of 1992, Gregory Thomas had been working for Mountain View Construction, a small outfit based in Durango that took jobs throughout the San Juan region. Company records from that period, pulled from archived tax documents, showed that Mountain View had been contracted to do renovation work on several properties in Silverton between December of 1991 and February of 1992. Campbell spread photocopies across Mitchell's desk, invoices and work orders that had been stored in a warehouse outside Durango for over 2 decades, documents that nobody had thought to examine in 1992 because Gregory Thomas's name had never come up as a person of interest. The papers showed that Mountain View Construction had done roofing repair on 3 homes in Silverton, had replaced siding on a commercial building downtown, and had performed basement waterproofing on 2 residential properties. One of those properties was listed as 847 Mineral Street, Patricia Keller's yellow house. The work order was dated December 14, 1991, less than a month before Patricia disappeared. The invoice indicated that Gregory Thomas and another worker had spent 3 days at the property, sealing foundation cracks and installing a drainage system in the basement. Mitchell felt something shift in her understanding of the case, felt 26 years of assumptions rearranging themselves into a new and terrible configuration. Gregory Thomas had been inside Patricia's house, had worked in her basement where that suspicious window was located, had intimate knowledge of the property's layout and vulnerabilities. He would have known about the window well, would have understood that the basement offered access to the house that neighbors couldn't observe. He would have seen Patricia's routines if he'd paid attention, would have noted when she left for work and when she returned home. The work order included a notation that payment had been made in cash, $750, and included Patricia's signature, confirming the work had been completed to her satisfaction. Her handwriting on that invoice, neat and precise, felt like a voice speaking from the grave. Tors pulled up more information on her laptop, a background on Gregory Thomas that she'd compiled over the past week. He'd been born in Laramie, Wyoming in 1964, had grown up in a working-class family, had dropped out of high school at 16 to work construction with his father. He'd moved around frequently throughout his 20s, following job opportunities across the Mountain West, never staying in one place longer than 2 years. In 1993, the year after Patricia disappeared, he'd left Colorado abruptly and moved to Las Vegas, where he'd worked for a large construction firm for 5 years. Then he'd moved to Portland, Oregon in 1998, where he'd remained ever since, working for a landscaping company called Evergreen Services. He'd never married, had no children on record. Lived alone in a small house in a working-class neighborhood southeast of the city. Campbell had already coordinated with the Portland Police Department to conduct surveillance on Gregory Thomas, and Tors showed Mitchell photographs taken over the past 3 days. The images showed a man who looked older than his 53 years, stooped and thin, driving a 15-year-old pickup truck to and from work, stopping at a grocery store where he bought frozen dinners and beer, returning to his small house where lights went on at 7 and off by 10. He looked like 1,000 other agging blue-collar workers, unremarkable and forgettable, exactly the kind of person who could disappear into the fabric of ordinary American life and never attract attention. But Campbell had learned from the Portland surveillance team that Gregory Thomas had one habit that stood out. Every year on January 8th, he took the day off work and spent it alone at his house with the curtains drawn, not answering his door or his phone. The coincidence of that date, the anniversary of Patricia's disappearance, hit Mitchell like a physical blow. Campbell said the Portland detectives had checked their records and confirmed that Thomas had been taking January 8th off for the past 20 years, always requesting it months in advance, always spending it in isolation. One neighbor had mentioned to police that Thomas got weird around that date, seemed depressed and withdrawn, but the neighbor had assumed it had something to do with a family death or personal tragedy. The pattern suggested guilt or grief or both, suggested that whatever had happened to Patricia Keller on that January night 26 years ago still haunted the man who'd very likely been responsible. Mitchell asked the obvious question, why hadn't Gregory Thomas been interviewed in the original investigation? Campbell had an answer that made everyone in the room feel sick. He'd pulled the complete case file from state archives and found that Mountain View Construction had been contacted during the initial canvass of local businesses, had been asked to provide a list of properties they'd worked on in Silverton during the relevant time period. But the company's records had been disorganized, the owner had been cooperative but scattered, and the list provided to investigators had been incomplete. Patricia's house hadn't appeared on it. Nobody had thought to verify the list against tax records or invoices. It was the kind of oversight that happened in small-town investigations with limited resources, the kind of missed connection that could haunt investigators for the rest of their careers. If someone had been more thorough in 1992, if someone had cross-referenced that list with property records, Gregory Thomas would have been interviewed within days of Patricia's disappearance. But he hadn't been, and so he'd continued his life for 26 years, moving from state to state, working ordinary jobs, carrying whatever knowledge he had about that January night like a stone in his chest. Campbell explained that the next steps would require careful coordination. They needed to obtain a warrant for Gregory Thomas's DNA to confirm the familial match, needed to build a prosecutable case that could withstand scrutiny in court 2.5 decades after the crime. They would need to interview Thomas, search his current residence and any storage units or vehicles he owned, look for evidence that he'd kept from 1992. Campbell warned that cold case prosecutions were notoriously difficult, that defense attorneys would argue contamination of evidence and faded memories and reasonable doubt. But for the first time in 26 years, Patricia Keller's case had a viable suspect, and the machinery of justice, slow and uncertain as it was, had begun to turn again. The arrest of Gregory Thomas happened on a rain-soaked morning in May of 2018, executed by Portland police with assistance from federal marshals who'd coordinated with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Thomas had been leaving his house at 6:30 for another day of landscaping work when 4 unmarked vehicles blocked his driveway and 8 officers emerged with weapons drawn. Neighbors who witnessed the arrest later told reporters that Thomas hadn't resisted, hadn't run or shouted or done anything except stand very still in the drizzle with his hands raised. his face going through a series of expressions that one witness described as moving from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like relief. He'd asked only one question before they handcuffed him: "Is this about Colorado?" The officers hadn't answered, but the question told them everything they needed to know about Gregory Thomas's guilt and the weight he'd been carrying for 26 years. Chief Mitchell received the call from Detective Campbell 40 minutes after the arrest, and within 2 hours, she was on the phone with Margaret Walsh, now 72 years old, and living in a retirement community in Durango, where she'd moved 3 years earlier when her arthritis had made mountain winters unbearable. Margaret had been eating breakfast when her phone rang, oatmeal growing cold in front of her as Mitchell explained in careful detail what the DNA evidence had revealed, who Gregory Thomas was, and what would happen next. Margaret didn't cry or exclaim or react with the dramatic emotion that television crime shows had taught people to expect. She simply sat in silence for nearly a minute before asking in a voice that sounded hollowed out whether Thomas had confessed, whether he told them what happened to Patricia's body. Mitchell had to say no, not yet, that Thomas had invoked his right to an attorney and hadn't spoken beyond that initial question in his driveway. The news of the arrest exploded through Silverton like dynamite in a mine shaft, the story reaching every corner of the small town within hours through phone calls and social media posts and excited conversations in the coffee shop and grocery store. For residents who'd lived there in 1992, the arrest felt like a seismic event, like the ground shifting beneath familiar landmarks. Patricia Keller's name was suddenly everywhere again, discussed by people who hadn't thought about her in years, remembered by younger residents who'd only heard vague stories about the woman who disappeared before they were born. The blue house on Mineral Street, which had been just another property for a decade, became a pilgrimage site where people drove past slowly, taking photographs, trying to imagine what had happened there 26 years ago. But as Detective Campbell and his team began the meticulous work of building a prosecutable case, they uncovered threads that pulled the investigation in directions nobody had anticipated. Gregory Thomas's phone records from 2018 showed regular calls to 3 numbers in Colorado, numbers that when traced led to people who'd lived in Silverton in 1992. The first number belonged to a woman named Helen Bauer, 68 years old, who'd worked as a secretary at Mountain View Construction during the early 90s and had left Colorado in 1993, the same year Thomas had departed. When Colorado investigators showed up at her house in Colorado Springs, where she'd lived quietly for 25 years, Helen initially denied knowing anything about Patricia Keller's disappearance, but when confronted with phone records showing she'd been in contact with Thomas as recently as 3 weeks before his arrest, she broke down crying and admitted she'd been carrying a terrible secret. Helen told investigators that on January 9, 1992, the morning after Patricia disappeared, Gregory Thomas had shown up at the Mountain View construction office in a state of near panic. He'd pulled Helen aside away from their boss and other co-workers and told her he'd made a terrible mistake, that something had happened that he couldn't take back. He'd asked Helen to help him, had given her specific instructions that she'd followed out of a combination of fear and misplaced loyalty to a co-worker she'd considered a friend. Thomas had asked Helen to remove certain work orders from the company's filing system to create confusion about which properties Mountain View had serviced in Silverton during December and January. Helen had done exactly that, had pulled Patricia Keller's invoices and work orders from the files and destroyed them, had created the incomplete records that had prevented investigators in 1992 from connecting Thomas to the Yellow House on Mineral Street. The revelation that Helen Bauer had actively obstructed the original investigation sent shock waves through the case that was somehow more disturbing than Thomas's arrest itself. She'd lived for 26 years knowing that her actions had allowed a killer to go free, had moved away from Colorado to escape the guilt, but had maintained contact with Thomas through occasional phone calls where they never discussed what had happened, but where the shared knowledge hung between them like smoke. Campbell and his team charged Helen with obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact, charges that her attorney argued were complicated by the passage of time and Helen's cooperation once confronted, but the damage to the original investigation had been catastrophic, had sent detectives chasing leads that went nowhere, while the real suspect vanished into the American landscape and built a new life somewhere else. The second phone number on Thomas's records belonged to a man named Carl Anderson, 71 years old, still living in Silverton, where he'd spent his entire life. Carl was the son of the elderly couple who'd lived next door to Patricia in 1992, and when investigators arrived at his house, he seemed to be expecting them. Carl told them a story that made the case even more complex and painful. In the days after Patricia's disappearance, Carl had been helping his parents sort through items in their garage when he'd found something disturbing hidden behind old paint cans and gardening tools. It was a woman's cardigan, dark blue with what looked like bloodstains on the collar and sleeve. Carl had recognized it as similar to cardigans Patricia wore, and he'd been preparing to take it to the police when Gregory Thomas had shown up at his parents' house. Thomas had explained to Carl that the cardigan was part of a misunderstanding, that he'd found it near Patricia's fence while working on another property, and had stored it in the Andersons' garage temporarily, that bringing it to police would only create confusion and false leads. Thomas had been persuasive and calm, and Carl, who was only 25 at the time and uncertain about how to handle the situation, had let Thomas take the cardigan and had never mentioned it to anyone, not even his parents. The guilt had eaten at Carl for years, had contributed to an ulcer that required surgery in 2004 and insomnia that he still treated with prescription medication. When Campbell asked why Carl hadn't come forward in the past 26 years, he could only say that the longer he waited, the more impossible it became to admit what he'd known and hidden, that silence had become a trap he couldn't escape. The third number led to the most shocking revelation of all. It belonged to a man named Richard Hoffman, 64 years old, who in 1992 had been the owner of Mountain View Construction, Gregory Thomas's employer. When investigators contacted Hoffman at his retirement home in Scottsdale, Arizona, he hired an attorney before agreeing to speak with them, and his statement revealed a level of complicity that transformed the case from a murder investigation into something darker and more systemic. Hoffman admitted that Gregory Thomas had come to him in late January of 1992 and confessed that he'd been involved in Patricia Keller's disappearance. Thomas had told Hoffman he'd become obsessed with Patricia during the basement waterproofing job, had returned to her house on the night of January 8th with the intention of talking to her, and that things had gone terribly wrong. Hoffman, faced with the possibility that his employee had committed murder and that the company could be held liable for hiring someone with a violent history, had made a calculated decision to protect his business. He'd paid for Thomas's relocation to Las Vegas, had provided him with cash and a reference letter under a slightly modified name, had actively helped Thomas escape investigation and start over somewhere else. Hoffman's motivation had been purely financial, rather than personal loyalty, and his cooperation had been purchased with money and the implicit understanding that Thomas would disappear and never connect himself to Mountain View Construction again. The revelation that a business owner had knowingly aided a suspected killer's escape was the kind of detail that made prosecutors salivate, and that would eventually feature prominently in news coverage that portrayed the case as a failure not just of investigation, but of basic human decency. The trial of Gregory Thomas began in February of 2019 in the San Juan County Courthouse, the same building where Patricia Keller had worked for 11 years, processing the mundane paperwork of other people's lives. The proceedings drew national media attention, camera crews from Denver and Salt Lake City setting up outside the courthouse steps, reporters doing stand-ups against the backdrop of snow-covered mountains that looked picturesque on television but felt oppressive to those who understood what secrets they'd kept for 27 years. Margaret Walsh attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row with a rigidity that suggested she was afraid that if she relaxed even slightly, she might shatter into pieces that could never be reassembled. She was 73 years old now, her hair completely white, her hands twisted with arthritis, but her eyes remained sharp and unforgiving as she watched the man who destroyed her closest friend finally face consequences. Gregory Thomas sat at the defense table looking diminished, as if the weight of 27 years of guilt had physically compressed him into something smaller than human scale. His attorney, a public defender named Jennifer Clark, who'd been assigned the case because Thomas had no money for private counsel, had argued strenuously for a change of venue, claiming that her client couldn't receive a fair trial in a community that had lived with Patricia's disappearance as an open wound for nearly 3 decades. The motion had been denied, and so the trial proceeded in Silverton with a jury pool drawn from residents who either remembered 1992 or had heard the story so many times it had become part of their inherited knowledge. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Michael Robinson, a career prosecutor from Durango who'd handled dozens of murder cases, but acknowledged that this one carried emotional freight unlike anything he'd experienced before. The prosecution's case was built on the DNA evidence from the fence fabric phone records, connecting Thomas to the 3 accomplices who'd helped him evade justice, and circumstantial evidence that painted a picture of obsession and opportunity. Robinson called witnesses who described Gregory Thomas's behavior during the basement waterproofing job. Co-workers from Mountain View Construction testified that Thomas had talked about Patricia Keller constantly during those 3 days in December, mentioning her appearance and her routines in ways that made them uncomfortable even at the time. One witness, a man named James Miller, who'd worked alongside Thomas, testified that Gregory had made a comment about Patricia living alone, about how vulnerable single women were in houses like hers, a comment that had seemed merely inappropriate in 1991, but took on sinister dimensions in retrospect. Helen Bauer testified as part of a plea agreement that had reduced her charges to obstruction of justice with a suspended sentence in exchange for complete cooperation. She took the stand looking 20 years older than her 69 years, her voice barely audible as she described how Gregory Thomas had shown up at the Mountain View office on that January morning with wild eyes and shaking hands, how he'd begged her to help him, how she destroyed the work orders without fully understanding what she was participating in. Defense attorney Clark tried to undermine her credibility during cross-examination, suggesting that Helen's memory after 27 years was unreliable and that she was embellishing details to satisfy prosecutors and the public's hunger for narrative closure. But Helen held firm to her story, and when Clark asked why the jury should believe someone who'd already admitted to destroying evidence, Helen looked directly at Thomas and said in a stronger voice that she'd been living in hell for 27 years and wanted nothing more than to tell the truth, finally, whatever it cost her. Carl Anderson testified next, describing the blood-stained cardigan he'd found in his parents' garage and how Gregory Thomas had convinced him to hand it over rather than taking it to police. The prosecution argued that the cardigan had likely contained Patricia's blood and DNA, that it represented the one piece of physical evidence that might have solved the case in 1992 if Carl had been braver or Thomas had been less persuasive. Anderson broke down crying on the stand when asked how he'd lived with the knowledge of what he'd done, how he'd watched the community tear itself apart with suspicion while he'd remained silent. His testimony was damaging not just to Thomas, but to the town's understanding of itself, revealing that multiple people had known pieces of the truth and had chosen self-preservation over justice, had allowed Patricia's family and friends to suffer in ignorance while they carried guilty secrets that might have freed them. Richard Hoffman testified via video link from Arizona, his attorney sitting beside him to ensure he didn't incriminate himself beyond what had been negotiated in his immunity agreement. Hoffman's testimony was cold and businesslike, acknowledging that he'd helped Gregory Thomas flee Colorado because he'd feared the liability his company would face if an employee was charged with murder. When Robinson asked if Hoffman had ever considered that his actions had prevented Patricia's family from getting answers, from having a body to bury, Hoffman paused for a long moment before saying he tried not to think about it, that thinking about it would have made continuing to live impossible. The jury's faces during this testimony showed disgust that transcended the defendant himself and extended to everyone who touched the case and made choices that prioritized convenience or self-interest over a dead woman's dignity. The defense's case was hampered by Gregory Thomas's refusal to testify, a decision that Jennifer Clark had argued against but ultimately had to respect. Clark called character witnesses from Portland who testified that Thomas had been a quiet, reliable employee for 20 years, had never shown signs of violence or aggression, had lived an unremarkable life that seemed incompatible with murder. But these witnesses withered under Robinson's cross-examination, which established that none of them had known Thomas before 1998, that all of them were describing a man who'd had 6 years to reinvent himself after fleeing Colorado. Clark tried to argue that the DNA evidence was circumstantially problematic, that skin cells on a fence didn't prove Thomas had killed Patricia Keller, only that he'd been in her yard at some point, possibly during the legitimate work he'd done the previous month. But this argument felt weak even as Clark made it, and the phone records connecting Thomas to his accomplices made it impossible to argue that his presence in Patricia's yard was innocent. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury deliberated for 14 hours before returning a verdict that surprised nobody but still hit Silverton like a physical force. Guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of improper disposal of human remains, guilty on both counts. Gregory Thomas showed no reaction as the verdict was read, simply staring at the table in front of him with the same exhausted expression he'd worn throughout the trial. Margaret Walsh allowed herself to cry for the first time in 27 years, tears running down her face as other spectators in the courtroom embraced and sobbed, and tried to process the strange sensation of closure that felt nothing like the relief they'd imagined. Chief Mitchell sat in the back of the courtroom and felt the weight of 26 years settled differently on her shoulders, no longer the weight of an unsolved case, but the weight of understanding how many people had failed Patricia Keller, how many small acts of cowardice had added up to decades of injustice. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later drew an even larger crowd, people standing in the hallway outside the courtroom when all the seats filled up. Judge Patricia Harrison, no relation to the victim, but aware of the eerie coincidence of sharing a first name, sentenced Gregory Thomas to 30 years to life for the murder and an additional 10 years for improper disposal of remains, sentences to run consecutively. Thomas would be 83 years old before he became eligible for parole, and Judge Harrison made clear in her statement that she hoped he would spend whatever years remained thinking about what he'd done, about the woman whose life he'd stolen, and the community he'd poisoned with his actions and his silence. Margaret Walsh was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement, and she stood at the podium with notes she'd written but found she couldn't read them, could only speak from the heart about Patricia's kindness, her resilience after losing her husband, her absolute lack of deserving anything that had happened to her. Helen Bauer received a suspended sentence and 5 years of probation for obstruction of justice, a punishment that felt to many both too lenient and impossibly hollow in the face of what she'd done. The courtroom that day had been silent when the verdict was read, as though everyone present understood that no sentence could truly balance the weight of 2.5 decades of silence. Carl Anderson, once a scared teenager manipulated by Thomas into complicity, was charged as an accessory after the fact. The prosecution, acknowledging the coercion and confusion of youth, granted him a plea deal, community service, a public apology, and restitution to a victims' rights organization. Richard Hoffman, whose quiet logistics had helped Thomas vanish into obscurity for years, faced the most tangible consequence: 18 months in a minimum security facility and a $250,000 restitution payment to a fund created in Patricia Keller's name. The judgments read like administrative exercises, legal punctuation marks on moral failures too vast to be contained by statute or sentence. Paperwork could close a case, but it could not cleanse a conscience. And yet, when the trials concluded and the media vans rolled out of Silverton, the mountain town did not return to what it had been before. It couldn't. Something invisible had fractured in the communal identity of the place, a quiet but irreversible awareness that evil had not come from outside the town, but had been living among them all along, hidden behind familiar faces and polite silences. Neighbors who had once exchanged casseroles and holiday cards now averted their eyes in the grocery store aisles. The realization that several townspeople had known fragments of the truth, and had chosen, consciously or otherwise, to keep them buried, forced everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity and the human instinct to look away. The town's collective myth of innocence had been punctured. In the small park near the courthouse, the weathered memorial bench that had long served as Patricia Keller's unofficial monument became the site of renewed reverence and quiet reckoning. The original brass plaque, tarnished to near illegibility, was replaced with a new one that gleamed in the sunlight. Beneath Patricia's name and the dates of her birth and death were engraved the words, "Justice delayed but not denied." Visitors began leaving fresh flowers again, sometimes notes folded beneath stones, simple messages of regret, remembrance, and apology. Margaret Walsh, who had searched the frozen woods that first terrible night and carried the ache of uncertainty for decades, lived just long enough to see the case closed. She passed away 8 months after the sentencing. Her obituary noted that she had lived to see her friend's truth restored, but those who knew her best understood the truth beneath the words. Closure had come, yes, but far too late to heal the part of her that had been frozen in time since January 8, 1992. Gregory Thomas, the man whose obsession had destroyed so many lives, never confessed to the details of that night. Not once. Even when prosecutors offered him leniency in exchange for the location of Patricia's remains, he refused, his silence thick with the arrogance of control. The prevailing theory, pieced together from evidence and testimony, suggested that Thomas had returned to Patricia's home under the cover of darkness, slipping through the basement window he'd become familiar with during his contracting work. What began as fixation, perhaps a confrontation, perhaps a plea, had escalated into violence. The footprints in the snow behind her house told only the beginning of the story, that Patricia had still been alive when she stepped into the yard barefoot under the hard January moon. But where the prints ended, so did the world's knowledge. Whatever came next existed only in Thomas's memory, and when he was led away to serve his sentence, he took that final truth with him, locking it behind a silence that would never break. In the years that followed, the Keller case became required reading in police academies across Colorado. It was studied not just for its tragedy, but for what it revealed about human error, the blind spots of small-town investigations, the ways limited resources and misplaced assumptions could let a killer vanish into the folds of ordinary life. It became a textbook example of how a simple oversight, failing to follow up with a contractor, misplacing a lab note, dismissing a fragment of fabric, could ripple outward into decades of suffering. But beyond its procedural lessons, the story stood as a testament to the endurance of evidence and the slow, relentless patience of science. It proved that truth, no matter how deeply buried, could one day rise from dust and silence, pulled back into the light by the precision of DNA and the persistence of those unwilling to forget. Yet for the people of Silverton, the resolution was not peace, it was a new kind of pain. Justice, when it finally arrived, was cold and clinical. It could convict, but it could not resurrect. It could name the guilty, but it could not restore the years that grief had hollowed out of those left behind. The truth had surfaced, yes, but it had come at a cost that no verdict could repay. And through it all, the house on Mineral Street remained. Its yellow siding had long since been painted blue, its new owners unaware, or perhaps deliberately forgetful of the echoes it held. The floors still creaked in the same places. The wind still whistled faintly through the attic vents. But within those quiet walls lingered the residue of everything that had unfolded there. The stillness of interrupted mornings, the echo of unanswered questions, the chill of a door left unlocked. The house stood like a witness that could not speak, a silent monument to everything Silverton had lost, and everything it would never truly understand.